seriously or thrown around as a joke, Boston is often referred to as one of the most racist cities in America. So we decided to send Roy Wood Jr. up to uncover why Beantown got that rep.
Boston, home to Mark Wahlberg, Donnie Wahlberg, and all of the rest of the Wahlbergs.
All right, so we're already off to a start with some extremely cringeworthy attempts at humor, but let's see where they go with this.
It's also home to Spotlight, the team of Boston Globe reporters who exposed the city's church sex scandal. I'm here because the Spotlight team has been asking another uncomfortable question. How racist is Boston? For decades, people have called Boston racist for numerous reasons. The Red Sox were the last baseball team to integrate.
As you can see by the graphic they supplied, it says, "With Yawkey at the helm." Tom Yawkey was the owner of the Boston Red Sox and well known for his opposition to integrating baseball. However, this is just one person and not representative of an entire city being racist.
Bostonians violently resisted desegregation.
This case is much more complicated. It wasn't all Bostonians. As you can see from the graphic they provided, it talks about South Boston, which was a well-known Catholic Irish-American working-class enclave. Now, without going into a full-length history lesson, the blacks and the Irish did not get along well. And in 1974, a federal judge by the name of Wendell Arthur Garrity Jr. mandated and oversaw integrating busing in what is still to this day the most control any judge has ever exercised over a school system in the entire history of the United States. One thing to note, by the way, is that public schools in Boston were not segregated as a matter of policy or law. In fact, later on, Judge Garrity noted that though Boston schools were not formally segregated, they showed a pattern of de facto racial distribution that amounted to unconstitutional segregation and that had to be corrected. But Judge Garrity determined that they were unconstitutionally segregated due to the racial makeup of the schools and demanded that schools be forcibly mixed racially via busing until no school in the city of Boston had more than 50% one race. This policy resulted in stabbings, shootings, and interracial violence between students and also caused white flight from the city of Boston to the suburbs and was generally seen as a failure. Anyways, I could do a whole video just on this topic, but for the sake of time, let's continue.
Even in 2017, fans at Fenway Park called Adam Jones the N-word.
An instance of a couple of rowdy fans yelling crude and unpleasant words at a player on an opposing team is nothing new. Sports are quite tribal, and fans unfortunately say and yell anything they think will throw the opposing team off their game. However, if this is an incident that's an example of Boston's overwhelming and disproportionate racism in the modern era, it's a poor example, because literally the next day after this incident occurred, Jones went on to receive a standing ovation from the Boston Red Sox crowd and also received an apology from the team. Jones even said, "I appreciate what the fans did. I have never on the road gotten any ovations or anything like that, so it just caught me off guard a little bit."
And all this got Spotlight curious. Reporter Akila Johnson.
So we wanted to look at why does Boston have the racist reputation and why does it deserve it?
How do you measure racism?
Well, you do it in a variety.
Like how many times the N-word is said in a day? Like a negrometer? Like a negrometer?
No.
N-word meter?
No.
Okay.
So one study we found showed that the median net worth of white families in Boston was $247,500. Compare that to the median net worth of black families in Boston, which was $8.
Like counting in thousands? Like $8,000?
No, just $8.
$8. That's not even a grande soy latte.
So here you can see the graph mentioned in the video as an example of racism cites that because there is such a large disparity between white and black net worth in Boston, that Boston must be a particularly racist city. So let's take a look at the article. The Spotlight Team article written in the Boston Globe is titled Boston Racism Image Reality. As you can see, it is a 7-part series which discusses different aspects of the issue of racism in Boston. However, if we scroll down in the first part of the article, we can see they are not focusing on racism in general. This inquiry, like the Spotlight series, focuses on the black community specifically, not all communities of color, because blacks have had the longest and most contentious history with racism in Boston. So as you can see, this article is not about racism, even though they are saying it is. It's more specifically an article about how racism is responsible for the plight of blacks. So let's take a look at the graph mentioned in the video. It shows white net worth in Boston sits at $247,500, while black net worth sits at a merely $8. But is this discrepancy evidence of racism by whites against people of color and blacks in particular? Well, let's take a look at the actual study cited for the article. The Color of Wealth in Boston, a joint publication of Duke University, the New School, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So this study covers various data points, and as you can see, the study mentions Asians early on in the study. Here, for example, we see different levels of education, marriage rates, and income between different races. For whites, we see 55.2% with a bachelor degree or higher and a marriage rate of 54% and a median income level of $90,000 a year. However, with American blacks, we start seeing some large disparities. 43.4% of blacks have a bachelor's degree or higher, only 24.8% are married, and the median income is $41,200 per year. Those last two numbers are less than half of those same figures for whites. However, are these differences due to a society that seeks to only promote whites and discriminate against all communities of color? Well, if we look at the same graph for Asians, we can see that 72.7% hold a bachelor degree or higher, 58% are married and have a median income of $96,000 per year. All of those numbers are higher than those for the white population. So is it really racism? Well, let's take a look at the net worth graph that was shown in the video. Now, as we take a look at the list and the various net worths, notice that one group is no longer included in the study that was included earlier on. Oh look, Asians aren't listed. I wonder why that is. Well, luckily in the study, they decided to mention why. Under the methodology section, if we scroll down to assets, debt, and net worth estimates, we can see them state, unfortunately, the sample size for Asians is too small to make any inferences. Now, this makes no real sense, and I would love for an explanation since the study under net worth, they show the net worth levels for groups like Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, even though those groups are much smaller than Asians in the Boston metro area. As you can see, in the entire state of Massachusetts, there are less than 300,000 Puerto Ricans, and for Dominicans, there's just over 100,000. But for Asians, when we measure just the Boston metropolitan area, there are over 348,000. That's close to the total number of blacks in the Boston metro area. So it makes no sense that there was a big enough sample size to calculate the net worth of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and even Caribbean blacks, but not enough for Asians. The likely reason Asians were not included is because it would destroy the racism-based narrative. As you can see by these graphs, Asian Americans have vastly outperformed other racial groups as far as income and wealth mobility. In fact, the most successful ethnic group in America are Indian Americans with a median income level of over $100,000 annually compared to whites at $71,300 annually. Anyways, let's go back and look at the graph. So in the video, they only show the difference between US blacks and whites in Boston as far as net worth. However, when you look at the graph in the actual study, you see that Caribbean blacks have a net worth of $12,000 versus $8 for US blacks. Why does that discrepancy exist? Is it due to educational differences? Well, if we scroll up to earlier in the study, we can actually see that when it comes to having a bachelor's degree or higher, US and Caribbean blacks are virtually identical in their education level. Is it due to racism? Well, as far as physical characteristics are concerned, American and Caribbean blacks look pretty much the same, and if anything, Caribbean blacks are darker and have more African ancestry. This issue clearly requires a lot more study and is much more nuanced than merely pointing out discrepancies in net worth between whites and blacks. But let's not get too harped on this one aspect. Let's continue with the video.
I'm sorry. I eat when I get sad about social inequality. If Boston is the cradle of equality, Spotlight wants to know why black enrollment at many of Boston's universities hasn't really gone up in 30 years.
All right, let's start with the first claim of black enrollment at the three following universities, of which Harvard is renowned for being arguably the best university in the world. What they show you is that black enrollment hasn't grown much from 1980 to 2015. What they don't show you is that white enrollment has actually decreased significantly, as you can see by the graphic shown, where each circle represents a percentage point. Also, you can see that every other group has grown in representation. International students have increased, Asian American students have increased, Hispanics have increased, and even others have increased. But is there really discrimination against blacks in the admission process of these elite universities? Actually, the data seems to show yes, they are discriminating in favor and not against blacks. In one study, it was shown that when the race of the applicant is taken into account, blacks are given a bonus of 230 points on their SAT scores, Hispanics a bonus of 185 points, and Asians are penalized and have 50 points subtracted from their score. Other studies have shown even bigger disparities. In fact, the same Harvard University this Daily Show segment claims is racist due to their low admission rates of blacks is actually being sued by Asian American students for racial discrimination against Asian students and giving preferential treatment to blacks who were less qualified. In fact, this year, Harvard published their recent admission rates and showed that 14.6% of those admitted to Harvard for the class of 2021 were African American, despite blacks being only 12% of the population and having the lowest average SAT scores of any race.
Or why there's so little diversity in boardrooms and hospitals.
Again, in these cases, they are pointing out that a disparity automatically means racism is to blame. But if we look at the NBA and the Boston Celtics in particular, an extremely disproportionate number of players are black. Does this mean that the NBA teams and the Boston Celtics discriminate against hiring non-black athletes? No, it just means that between groups you will find differences in skill, ability, interests, etc. There is a reason you find so many Asians in electrical engineering, Jews in comedy, and so many blacks in sports and entertainment. These disparities are not signs of discrimination, but rather the preferences and differences between groups.
Or how among 8 major cities, black people voted Boston the least welcoming to people of color.
Now, this is purely a subjective measurement by people who probably haven't even been to all, if even most of these cities. So they probably don't have the most accurate basis for comparison.
Surely the people of Boston must be feeling all that structural racism. To find out, I went to one of the city's most beloved cathedrals, Fenway Park.
I don't see that racism myself, honestly.
No, I don't think Boston's a racist city.
I think that we've got a lot of attention with our sports being in the media.
So Boston's racist reputation is a conspiracy formed by people who hate Boston sports teams for winning all the damn time.
Yes, they love to hate us.
Yeah, I don't think of Boston as a racist city at all.
So how do you know?
I don't feel it. You know, it's just a gut feel. I don't feel like it's racist. I've just never encountered it.
Huh. The Spotlight says the city has a race problem. Why haven't these Bostonians seen it?
You can hear people in the audience laughing at this man for saying he doesn't feel the city is racist, much like the previous people interviewed, because he was describing his subjective feelings about the level of racism in the city. Now, this is somehow illegitimate, yet the audience did not laugh at the graph which was just shown, which also measured subjective feelings of blacks about which city is less welcoming of blacks.
The NAACP's Tanisha Sullivan has a theory.
The Spotlight gave us data to support what black people in and around this city already knew.
So if the data was news to you, you called the article the Spotlight article. But if you already knew about it, you just called it, that's what the I've been trying to tell y'all article.
Because the racism is not as overt, it's difficult for people who don't experience it on a day-to-day basis to realize that it's there.
So you hear the NAACP representative admit that the racism in Boston is not overt. So this makes the alleged racism harder to see. She states that the Spotlight article shows data to support that the city is racist. But like we've been saying during this whole video, a disparity does not mean there is racism, especially if other communities of color are doing disproportionately better than other communities of color and sometimes even better than whites. To say these differences are strictly or even mostly due to racism without direct evidence of racism is intellectually lazy and dishonest.
Ah, I get it. I've been asking the wrong people. If you want to know if Jurassic Park is safe, you don't ask the dinosaurs.
It's not as racist as it used to be, but there are some blatant problems.
A white person walks into a room in Boston, they don't have to think about that I'm the only white person here.
Why is that a problem? Isn't a part of eliminating racism the idea of eliminating race as a characteristic of importance? So what if you're the only member of a particular group in a room? Why is that necessarily a negative thing? Ethnically, I'm Persian, and I am often the only person of my particular ethnic background in a room, city, and sometimes even country. But that doesn't mean that I'm facing racism or that I'm at a disadvantage. In many cases, it means that I'm unique and I stand out from the crowd. Whether something is negative or positive is often a matter of perspective. Also, in many parts of Boston, it's very possible for a white person to be the only white person in a room. This does not necessarily mean the white individual is in a racist situation. Anyways, the rest of the video doesn't really contain any new information or stats. It's basically just a few attempts at comedy and trolling Boston Red Sox fans about racism in Boston, and then the Daily Show reporter ends on this note.
Fighting structural racism is going to be exhausting, but if white people are willing to put in the legwork, we'll get there.
Roy Wood Jr., everyone.
So basically, he puts all the responsibility for the lack of progress made by blacks, particularly in Boston, on whites, and says that it's up to white people to put in the work to fix black underachievement. He puts no responsibility on the black community at all, despite no one forcing the black community into high rates of single motherhood, murder, crime, low graduation rates, SAT scores, etc. Personal, familial, and community-wide responsibility has to be a part of the discussion. It's always more convenient and personally satisfying to blame an external force outside your control as the source for all ailments and problems faced by you or your community. However, if we actually care about solving real problems, then we have to be honest and real in diagnosing the problem and not just blaming white people for everything. Anyways, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you would like to support this channel, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. And not only will you help support more videos like this, but you will gain access to exclusive video clips, our members-only Discord, as well as other perks. So please go to www.patreon.com/nuancebro to become a patron today. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time, bro.
On a scale of Jazzy Jeff to Jeff Sessions, how uncomfortable is it for black people? Tell me when to stop. Come across. Go across. This is Jeff Sessions right here. Stop. Right there.